Most of the guys who are doing the absolute worst are not in a position that they could say publicly, I have a second job, I'm borrowing money from my parents.
Right.
Honestly,
One UFC floor seat costs more than what a fighter makes risking brain damage in the octagon. That's not capitalism. That's something far more sinister, and it's completely legal.
Like, oh, this is perfect for us. The network for men, they can't deny this.
We give them the pitch. They couldn't wait to get the out of this meeting.
The UFC operates like a cartel, crushing competition and controlling fighter destinies. Here's the disturbing proof nobody talks about. But before we dive in, hit that like and subscribe to the Band-Aid Battalion as we bring you the truth behind the fights. Let me hit you with something absolutely insane.
Well, that's them pulling in right there. This other one must be pulling.
At UFC 306, the worst floor seat, literally the cheapest one on the floor, cost $12,000. One seat for one person to sit and watch. Meanwhile, a fighter who trained for months, cut weight, risked permanent brain damage, and fought their heart out, if they lost, they walked away with $10,000 before taxes, before paying coaches, before paying managers. A chair was worth more than a human being fighting for their life. But here's where it gets even crazier. This isn't because the UFC is broken. This is strategic. This is intentional. And when you understand how they built this system, you'll realize the UFC doesn't just dominate MMA, they've essentially created a monopoly that would make old-school mob bosses jealous. Rewind to the 2000s. MMA wasn't just the UFC. You had real competition. Pride FC in Japan was putting on stadium shows with 60,000 screaming fans. Strikeforce was building stars in the US. WEC was showcasing the best lighter weight fighters on the planet. Elite XC was getting primetime network television deals. Back then, fighters had leverage. If the UFC lowballed you, guess what? You could go to Pride and get paid. You could sign with Strikeforce and build your brand. Competition meant fighters actually had negotiating power. The UFC couldn't treat fighters like disposable commodities because, here's the crazy part, they actually had somewhere else to go. But then something shifted, and it wasn't a fair fight. The UFC did what every massive corporation does when they want total control. They didn't outcompete their rivals. They eliminated them, one by one, methodically. Almost beautifully evil if you think about it. Pride FC, bought out in 2007, stripped for parts, shut down, gone. Strikeforce, absorbed in 2011. Every valuable fighter moved to the UFC. The brand, erased. WEC merged into the UFC in 2010. Their entire roster became UFC property. Elite XC collapsed, and the UFC swooped in like vultures picking at the remains. This wasn't a competition, this was consolidation. And when the dust settled, only one real alternative remained: Bellator. Now Bellator tried. They really did. They signed UFC castoffs like Rampage Jackson, Chael Sonnen, and Tito Ortiz, guys with name value. They developed their own stars like Patricio Pitbull Freire, Michael Venom Page, and Douglas Lima. For a moment, Bellator was legitimate competition. Not UFC level, but enough to create options for fighters. But here's the thing about options in a near monopoly: they're temporary. Bellator started making terrible business decisions, their matchmaking became a joke, and their leadership couldn't scale the operation. And while Bellator crumbled under its own weight, the UFC kept growing exponentially. Then came the McGregor era in the mid-2000s. Mainstream explosion, celebrity status, record-breaking pay-per-views. The UFC wasn't just the biggest MMA promotion anymore, it was MMA. Everything else was amateur hour. Here's where it gets really dark. Once Bellator finally died, bought by PFL in 2023, the game completely changed. Fighters lost their last negotiating chip. Now, if you want to be seen as the best, if you want any kind of mainstream recognition, if you want to make a legitimate living fighting, you have one option: the UFC. That's not a free market. That's a cartel structure. Think about what cartel actually means. It's when one entity controls supply, eliminates competition, and sets prices without regard for fair market value because consumers, or in this case, fighters, have no alternatives. The UFC decides who gets signed. They decide who gets pushed. They decide who makes money. You don't negotiate like a professional athlete in any other major sport. You accept their offer, or you fade into complete obscurity. And most fighters can't afford to walk away, because there's nowhere to walk to. Now, if you're a superstar like Adesanya, John Jones, or Conor McGregor, you're probably getting paid handsomely. These guys bring eyeballs, they move merchandise, they justify their value. The UFC cuts bigger checks because these fighters have leverage through popularity. But here's the absolutely criminal part. For everyone else, the starting pay hasn't changed in over 15 years. That $10,000 to show, $10,000 to win the contract? It's been the same since 2010. The $50,000 performance bonus? Same since the Brock Lesnar era. Meanwhile, what's happened to the UFC's revenue? It exploded. Pay-per-view prices have doubled. Gate records are being shattered left and right. Dana White literally can't do an interview without bragging about breaking another revenue record. We just did an $11.5 million gate. We hold the top 3 highest gates of all time. The UFC is making 10 times what they made in 2010. Maybe more. But the fighters at the bottom, still stuck at 10 and 10. Let me break down just how insulting this is. You're a new UFC fighter. You sign the contract. You train for 3 months. You cut weight, one of the most brutal physical experiences a human can endure. You step into a cage where someone is legally trying to render you unconscious. You fight. You lose. You get $10,000. Before taxes, after taxes, you're at about $7,000. Then you pay your coach, usually 10%. You pay your manager another 10 to 20%. You're left with maybe $4,000 to $5,000 for months of work, for brain damage, for permanent physical wear on your body. It's literally more profitable to beg on the street than to lose a UFC fight. Think about that for a second. Let that sink in. A professional athlete in the world's premier MMA organization can make less money than panhandling. That's not just exploitation, that's systematic degradation. But wait, it gets worse.
Ended up giving both guys a UFC contract that night, which made the place even go crazier.
Because it's not just about low pay, it's about total control. The UFC controls everything. They control who you fight. They pick your opponents based on what makes sense for their business, not your career. They control when you fight. They decide your schedule. And if they want to shelve you for a year, they can. They control what you earn. They set your purse with zero market pressure. And here's the real kicker. They control what sponsors you can have. Remember when fighters could have their own sponsors? When they'd walk into the cage covered in logos, each one worth 5 figures, sometimes 6 figures per fight? That was real money. That was how mid-tier fighters actually survived. Guys who weren't champions were making $30,000, $50,000, even $100,000 extra per fight just from sponsors plastered on their shorts. The UFC killed it, completely eliminated it. Now you can only wear UFC-approved sponsors. And who gets the sponsorship money? Not you, the UFC does. Fighters get a tiered bonus based on how many fights they've had. It's pennies compared to what they used to make. A fighter who used to earn $50,000 in sponsor money now gets maybe $5,000 from the UFC's sponsor pool. That's a 90% pay cut disguised as a uniform deal. And don't even get me started on pay-per-view money. You'd think if you're a champion on a card that sells 1 million pay-per-views at $2 per buy, you'd make $2 million, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Here's how the UFC actually structures it, and this is genius-level greedy. From 0 to 500,000 buys, you get $1 per buy. That's $500,000. Then from 500,000 to 750,000 buys, you get $1.50 per buy. That's another $375,000. Then from 750,000 to 1 million buys, you finally get $2 per buy. That's another $500,000. So instead of $2 million, you actually get $1,375,000. They're paying you in tiers like it's a cell phone data plan. Even when you're the main event selling out the entire card, they've structured the payout to shortchange you by $625,000. Over $500,000 just vanishes because of their tier system. And that's only if you're a champion with pay-per-view points in your contract, which most fighters don't even have. And here's the most cartel-like aspect of all. You can't complain. You can't speak out. Because if you do, you might never get booked again. The UFC has made examples of fighters who criticized the pay structure. Suddenly, their next fight gets pushed back 6 months. Or they get matched against an absolute killer who's 3 weight classes naturally bigger. Or they just stop getting calls. This is how you maintain control without explicit threats. You create an environment where speaking truth to power means career suicide. You make one example out of a loudmouth, and everyone else falls in line. It's psychological warfare, disguised as business operations. The UFC isn't just a fight promotion anymore. It's the gatekeeper to everything: fame, money, legacy, legitimacy. If you want to be considered the best in the world, you must fight in the UFC. There's no alternative path, no secondary route to greatness. This is an unprecedented power in combat sports. Even boxing, with all its corruption and fragmented belts, has multiple major promotions. Fighters can bounce between Top Rank, Matchroom, PBC, and others. There's actual competition for talent. Floyd Mayweather could play promoters against each other. Canelo Alvarez signed the biggest contract in sports history because promoters were bidding for him. In MMA, it's UFC or nothing. There's no bidding war. There's no leverage. There's no negotiation. You take what Dana White offers, or you fight in a high school gym for $500 and a t-shirt. Some people say it's just business. They built the brand and took the risks. But that ignores reality. The UFC has total market dominance. No one can compete with their capital and recognition. They control everything: access, compensation, sponsors. That's not a free market. That's a cartel with absolute control. So what do you think? Should the UFC pay fighters more? And would you still sign with them knowing all this? Drop your answers below and smash that like and subscribe button.